Thank you, Raheem, and thank you so much for that generous introduction. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time in your busy day to come and hear me speak by Zoom. This is a real honor to be able to speak for the Pourdavoud Center, and Raheem, I'm just so grateful to have this opportunity. I also want to thank Marissa Stevens for doing the organizing logistics, not just for this, but for the many other events, and a couple of other folks. Some of the original research for this project began about 5 years ago in a project that was set up by my colleague Janet Afari at UC Santa Barbara. And we received support from the Gramian Emrani Foundation and Haile Emrani. So I wanted to take a moment to thank those colleagues for their support for a project that I'm kind of picking up after 5 years in a different direction. And I'd also like to acknowledge some members of the California community in the form of History Advocates, which is a Bay Area community group of Persian and Iranian Americans who I've worked with to change California's middle school standards for the teaching of history, including accurate portrayals of Persian history in all its periods. So welcome to all of you. It's really great to be here. Raheem mentioned my book. My book is actually out, and I won't say anything more about it except to mention that when John Wesley Gilbert was a young student at Brown University in 1887, he actually attended lectures on Achaemenid history. This was a set of lectures that were presented by David Gordon Lyon of Harvard University. I think you can see him. You can see him in your upper right. And those lectures included a lecture on the Cyrus cylinder that a young John Wesley Gilbert attended in 1887. So there is a link, although small, between my most recent book and the growing study of the Persian Empire in the United States. So whether you believe it is two different dynasties or two different aspects of the same dynasty, the Teispid Achaemenid or the Achaemenid dynasty, the Persian Empire compels attention in ancient world history for its geographical extent, covering more than a dozen modern countries, for its diverse cultures, for its engagement with important historical events and processes. And as someone who was trained in the beginning in Greek history, which is off the western edge of this map, it's been a process over the past 15 years of becoming more and more involved in the study of the Achaemenid world. And from the time of a generation ago of Pierre Briand's foundational work up to the most recent companion, edited by Bruno Jacobs and Robert Rollinger, which we saw a terrific discussion about in a recent Pourdavoud Center event, it's become clear that studying Achaemenid Persia requires a global and multidisciplinary perspective. Yet at the same time, as Raheem pointed toward in his introduction, the Greek sources are never going to go away. We have our Greek sources. The narrative of the Greeks, as difficult as it is to work with them, is always going to have a place in our study of the Achaemenid. And it's sort of at the intersection of these two places, the global multidisciplinary and the particular perspective of Greek sources, that I'm going to speak to you today about the women companions of Cyrus the Younger. And we can start with a story that begins with a civil war between a Persian prince and his brother, the king of the Achaemenid Empire in 401 BC. And in that war, the young Persian prince Cyrus the Younger marched his army, the numbers are uncertain, 20 to 40,000 troops, from his base at Sardis in what is today modern Western Turkey, down into Babylonia to confront his brother against the context of a revolt in Egypt, which had broken out just a few years before he began this attempt on the throne. The two brothers met at a place that ancient sources call Cunaxa, depending on your chronology, as those of you who know the inside baseball on this, sometime between September and November 401. And Cyrus was killed, putting an end to his attempt on the throne. Several decades later, the story of Cyrus' attempt on the throne was put down by the Greek writer Xenophon of Athens in his Kuru Anabasis, or Cyrus's March Up Country, composed sometime in the late 370s early 360s. And that is where we begin our story today, with a passage from Xenophon. Recounting the aftermath of the Battle of Cunaxa, Xenophon records the events after the death of Cyrus. And I won't read these texts word for word, but I want you to have them. And if afterwards you want the PDF or you want the slides, I'd be happy to get them to you. After Cyrus' death, Artaxerxes broke into the Greek and the Persian, and Cyrus's Persian troops fled away. Then, continues Xenophon, the king and his men seized a large amount of plunder, notably Cyrus' Phocian concubine, or Palakida is the Greek term, said to be wise and beautiful. And then Xenophon continues in this story. I'm sorry about the difficulties with advancing. That the second concubine, the Milesian, was captured by the king's entourage, but succeeded in escaping. And she was saved by some Greeks in the baggage train who happened to be armed, and saved her as well as others who came within their lines. So this is a story written by an eyewitness, a participant in these events, but several decades after the fact. What do we do with this story? Traditionally, the focus has been on these concubines as an aspect of the exotic portrayal of the Persians, or the lurid stories about the large number of Persian concubines, a perspective that still shows up in the notes to Shane Brennan and David Thomas's landmark Anabasis. By the way, a wonderful text. If you're interested in Anabasis, this is the place to go. For Brennan and Thomas, the concubine's presence is about an exotic portrayal of the Persian king, and something about their access to large numbers of concubines. A more political perspective is advanced by John Hyland, who happens to be in the audience today and actually had read an earlier version of this talk. So John, you know where I'm going. Hyland suggests that, or connects the enslavement of the Phocian women with the Persian reconquest of Phocaea in the late years of the Peloponnesian War. And an even more directly political approach is advanced by Sean Manning in a terrific article, which is a prosopography of the followers of Cyrus the Younger. It explicitly leaves out the two female followers of Cyrus, noting that as Ionian Greeks, they belong in a study of the Cyrus relations with the Greeks of Asia. And that's essentially what I want to focus on here, is how these two women reflect Cyrus's interaction with the Greeks of Ionia. So I'll lay out my hypothesis for you. Despite the portrayal of their exoticness and their position as concubines, these two women were not mere pleasure objects. Instead, their presence in the army reflects Cyrus' desire to maintain support for his cause amongst the Ionian Greeks, and I would add, possibly amongst the Persian elites of Ionia. And I'll pursue this in 4 sections. First, I want to talk to you a bit about the family of Cyrus the Younger, for those of you who are not familiar with his line. Second, I want to examine sources beyond Xenophon for the two companions of Cyrus. Third, I want to put those sources into the context of, wives and concubines, especially at the Achaemenid court. And then finally, I want to look at the political context of these two cities, Miletus and Phocaea, in 401 BC. So that is an outline of where we are headed today. So let's start with Cyrus' family. Here is a family tree with Cyrus at the bottom, brought together from Greek sources such as Ctesias and Plutarch and Xenophon and Herodotus. Once again, we have to rely on Greek sources as much as we have cuneiform and other documents from the regions of the empire. Cyrus was the son and the grandson of kings. But as the family tree shows you, his own father, Darius II, had come to power after a dynastic struggle, the details of which we can get from Greek sources and from a smattering of cuneiform tablets. We don't have time to get into the details here, but after a struggle, a 3-way struggle for the throne, it was Darius II who took power in January of 423. And according to our sources, Cyrus was born after the time his father became king. Several of the contenders for the throne, including Darius himself, were the children of people whom Ctesias calls Babylonians, or names as concubines. And Ctesias, in fact, the Greek author, speaks of 17 nothos, or bastard children that Artaxerxes had with various women. And their names are quite interesting, as rendered in Greek, to see the possibilities for matching with Babylonian or Old Persian names. Alogune, for example, we can derive, and I'm working with evidence and analysis of scholars such as Rudiger Schmidt and Ranzad, others, from an old Iranian name that has royal associations, and it means something like red or vermilion colored. Ctesias's Greek Kosmartidene, likewise, we can derive from a Babylonian theophoric name, and a third woman with whom Artaxerxes is said to have children, Andia. This name may come from a pet name, which ultimately derives from an Akkadian name for a slave girl or servant girl. Working one generation down to Cyrus's mother, we have good evidence from Babylonian documents for her name. And that is, of course, the famous Parousatis in Greek sources, which we have her name rendered in Babylonian tablets, probably rendering an Old Persian term full of bliss. So Cyrus the Younger was the product of 3 generations of dynastic intermarriage that incorporated people who, according to our Greek sources, were Babylonian, but may well have been of mixed ancestry, Iranian and Babylonian. And when he was sent out, he was just a teenager, born in 423, he was just a teenager when he was appointed overlord of imperial forces in the far west of the empire and satrap of Lydia, Phrygia, and Cappadocia. And in this capacity, Cyrus played a major role in supporting Sparta and bringing the Peloponnesian War to a successful close with a Spartan victory and leading to the defeat of Athens. But as that war came to a close, he was summoned to court by his father, Darius II. That's actually the point where the story of the Anabasis begins, as Darius gets old and summons his two elder sons, Artaxerxes and Cyrus, to court. Now, our sources vary on what happened at court, but we do know that Artaxerxes took the throne in spring 404, and he detained Cyrus, either because Cyrus was falsely accused or because he was actually up to something. And it was their mother, Parousatis, who intervened and allowed Cyrus to return to his capital at Sardis. So for the next 2 years, Cyrus secretly prepared for war against his brother Artaxerxes. Now, the most famous part of his preparations are the Greek mercenaries, later known as the 10,000. But it's important to remember that his preparations for war included making friends with and gaining support from local Greek cities, and also gaining the support of local Achaemenid elites, because Cyrus wasn't just planning to win a war, but to become king in his brother's stead. So he needed a way to gain lasting political support and lasting legitimacy. So that gives us some background on Cyrus, and it reminds us that every action he took, whether it was training his troops in secret or making alliances or choosing who would accompany him on the campaign, including women, must have been a conscious choice. It was not done offhand. So now to our second part, ancient sources beyond Xenophon. One of the curious points about the sources for these 2 women companions is that Ctesias of Cnidos, who was Artaxerxes' physician, appears not to have mentioned their presence in the army, and that is quite interesting. Assuming that we just haven't just lost a portion of Ctesias that mentioned them, Ctesias at several points provides a court perspective that differs from the Greek perspective that Xenophon offers, and that suggests that from the start that these women are of more than incidental interest. Ctesias' omission, in other words, could be meaningful. We must go down several centuries, though, to get a longer set of testimonies from the Greek biographer Plutarch, who wrote in the 1st century AD, and as Dominique L'Enfant and others have shown, is perhaps following the Greek writer Danon of Colophon, who wrote in the 340s, and in this case, narrating events that happened many years after the battle. This story that Plutarch relates describes an old Artaxerxes II being asked for a favor by his son Darius. And the favor that the son asked is for Aspasia, who had been the special favorite of Cyrus and was then a concubine of the king. In essence, Plutarch's story here expands on the brief notice that Xenophon gives about the Phocian being learned or being beautiful and wise, but it adds some details about her family, born of free parents, and about her level of education, and it kind of gives her a personality in a way that Xenophon's account doesn't. If this in fact goes back to Danon in the 340s, we have information that's within a few generations of the life of Cyrus and his women companions. This is not the only place where Plutarch mentions the woman he names Aspasia. In his life of Pericles, again, perhaps following Danon, he mentions Aspasia and says that Cyrus gave the same name of Aspasia to his concubine, the one he loved best, adding that she was called a Milto before. So these two passages from Plutarch add valuable additional information, perhaps going back as early as the fourth century BC. We have to wait until a century later, a brief passage from Athenaeus's Deipnos Ephistae, for another suggestion of the sources for the Phocian's name and life. Athenaeus mostly follows Plutarch and Xenophon, but he credits a writer named Xenophanes, who shows up just one other time in Athenaeus and is otherwise unknown as a source for this name change from Milto to Aspasia. If we could pin a date on Xenophanes, it would be very, very helpful, but at the least we can suggest that there's another early source which has information about the names of Cyrus's Phocian companion. Now, maybe the most famous and the most studied, the most studied of the later sources for Cyrus' women companions is from the Roman author Aelian in his historical miscellany, which adds all sorts of details about Milto Aspasia and kind of turning her story into a fairy tale. And this text has been extensively analyzed, especially by scholars interested in the development of Roman literature and the novel, the antique novel. And I don't think that there's much in this that we can say gives us an accurate historical evidence for the lives of the Phocian women or the Milesian women. So I'm mostly going to lay that last passage aside in my analysis. Okay, so now we have an idea of where Cyrus is coming from. We have an idea of additional source material that the ancient sources give us for the two women companions of Cyrus. And now it's time to look a bit about the meanings of wives and concubines, especially in the Achaemenid court context. Once again here, we have to face the challenge of the Greek narrative sources, because we've got lots of narrative sources, and many of them focused on the Persian Empire in a sort of moralizing way, setting up the Persians as the opposite or the inverse of what is Greek, set up the Persians as quote unquote barbarians, and so on, even while sometimes admiring Persian practices. In the Greek context, there was a distinction made not just between concubines and wives, but also between what might be translated as mistresses. And the classic Greek statement of how these three categories of women differed is from a law court speech from the late 340s, Pseudo-Demosthenes' speech against Neaera. We keep mistresses, hetairai, for pleasure, concubines, palakai, for the daily care of our persons. Whatever that means is a little vague. But wives, gynekes, to bear us legitimate children and be faithful guardians of our households. I think what is interesting for us here is to recognize that Greek conceptions of concubines differ from the modern stereotypes of concubines as a pleasure object. And if we could, we would perhaps discard the word concubine entirely and just use the Greek term, but it's kind of entered our scholarly lexicon. And we're kind of stuck with saying concubines, even though the Greek conception of concubines is not entirely as a pleasure object. In fact, in the Pseudo-Demosthenes rendering, it's the Hetairai who are under that category. When it came to Persians, Greek authors often focused, especially in the 4th century, but starting as early as Herodotus, on the large number of concubines that Persians had, especially Persian nobles. A classic statement is from Herodotus, 5th century BC, who in his famous section on Persian customs speaks about Persians having many legitimate wives and acquiring still more concubines. Now, in a recent article, Dominique L'Enfant has made a very important qualification, I think, to this passage. Her article notes that only 4 of the 11 kings, or the dozen kings we have evidence for, are noted as having multiple wives. And in many instances, it is clear that Greek texts talk about the single wife, the one wife of the king. Nonetheless, the distinction between a wife on the one hand and many concubines on the other hand is an attitude that we see in many Greek sources regarding the Persian Empire. If we turn to sources from the empire itself, we can appeal to an excellent chapter in the recent companion to the recent companion edited by Rollinger and Jacobs. Madreiter and Schnegg note that the indigenous sources indirectly support this distinction in classical sources between legitimate wives and other female companions. We have possibly Elamite terms that match up to these categories, although we do not have Old Persian terms that match up to the Greek categories. And the Greeks themselves imagine that the Persians had borrowed the institution of the palakis from somewhere else. One possibility moderns would suggest would be the Neo-Syrian Empire, which had a developed palace and court structure, and in which we know of a category of women named as concubines. So as Sarah Melville and Karen Radner have noted, the of concubines at the Neo-Assyrian court could include a wide range of people, not simply pleasure objects in the modern stereotypical sense. Women, foreign hostages and guests, household members of defeated kings, and others could all fall under this category. So when we were talking about the concubines of Cyrus, as mentioned by Xenophon and then Plutarch and the other Greek writers, considering these categories takes us away from the stereotype of pleasure object and into the distinction between legitimate wife, in the case of the Achaemenid Empire, of someone of Persian ancestry, and concubines who might be of many different statuses and were perhaps tied together by their status as being foreigners. That is, they weren't part of the dominant Persian elite of the empire. So with these 3 backgrounds in mind, let me turn to the my fourth and longest section of my presentation today. And to talk a bit about the political cons of Miletus and Phocaea in 401 BC. Here you see a map of Cyrus's, the region that Cyrus ruled, roughly here. The Xenophon's account mentions troops that are drawn from places as far north as the Caicus River Valley, where we know of local nobles who supported him, and as far south as Tralles in the Meander Valley, where he apparently had a major garrison. Of course, his capital here at Sardis, and the troops mustering in this area in the plain of the Castolis River, somewhere here. Xenophon also mentions Cyrus' control of the cities of Ionia, with one major exception, Miletus, which at the time Cyrus set out on his campaign was not under his control. And we'll get to Miletus in a second. So think back again to Cyrus preparing for a campaign against his brother between 403 and 401 BC. He needs to account not only for his brother the king, but also for possible competition or threat from other major Persian figures in the region. For example, Pharnabazos, the satrap at Deskylium in Phrygia, and Tissaphernes, who has strongholds in Caria. And at least according to Xenophon's account, Tissaphernes has been at odds with Cyrus ever since Cyrus returned from his detention at the Persian court. If Cyrus is going to launch a military campaign against his brother and succeed in battle, and also be able to hold on to that success, he's going to need to maintain control of his base here of Lydia and Ionia, and to retain the support of key elements in this region, which would be the leaders of Greek cities, his mercenary generals, and the local Iranian aristocrats who have settled in this region since Cyrus the Younger arrived more than 130 years before. So winning the war or winning the battle of Conaxa is not Cyrus's only concern. He needs to think about political support. And it's in those contexts that Miletus and Phocaea play particularly important roles. So let's go first to Miletus, which you can see down here. If you visit Miletus today, it is difficult to get a sense of how strategically and geographically important the site was in the time of Cyrus, because the silting of the Meander River has resulted in an enormous floodplain, leaving Miletus sort of high and dry here in the center, depriving the viewer of a good understanding of the strategic position of this town, which in the centuries before Cyrus was a major colonizer, was known for its prosperity, was famous as the ornament of Ionia. If we consider Miletus' long-term relations with the Achaemenid Empire, some interesting points emerge. First, when Miletus enters the empire around 540, it does so on special terms. It has a special relationship with Cyrus the Elder, according to Herodotus, entering as an ally rather than a subject. And even so, Miletus' relationship with the empire is fraught. It plays a leading role in the Ionian revolt between 499 and 494, and the Persians, in fact, destroy the site at the end of the revolt, although it is soon rebuilt. And by the time of Xerxes' invasion of Greece, we have evidence from Milesian troops joining that expedition against Greece. Milesian history in the 5th century BC is dominated by the imperial competition between Athens and the Achaemenids along this coast. And we know from literary sources, inscriptions, including the Athenian tribute list, that between about 470 and 412, Miletus was a tribute-paying member of the Athenian League. But after that period, it broke away, and it, along with other cities along the coast, joined in the general revolt against the Athenian Empire that occurred in the late years of the Peloponnesian War. Now, Miletus was a particular flashpoint in the later years of Cyrus's tenure in Asia Minor, when he was overlord of the coast and satrap of Lydia, Phrygia, and Cappadocia. In particular, between 405 and 401, Tissaphernes, who I mentioned as a rival of Cyrus, and Cyrus himself supported rival regimes, often helping one side to overthrow the existing government, and then giving sanctuary and payments and refuge to the people who were exiled, and going back and forth in several different phases. So Miletus was a flashpoint between Cyrus and Tissaphernes for control of Ionia. But the Milesians were so attached to Cyrus that a number of exiles joined Cyrus's army. And this is notable because they are the one large contingent, a city contingent given a specific name who joined Cyrus. And they even get a specific call out in Xenophon's glowing obituary of Cyrus, where, as he says, Cyrus showed by his words and his actions he would never stop being their friend, not even if their situation became worse, and they became even fewer in number. So in Cyrus's need to maintain political support in Ionia, Miletus had a special place. You might say it's a unique double place. On the one hand, has a special relationship to Cyrus the Elder, so Cyrus the Younger may have drawn on that. On the other hand, it is a symbol of Greek resistance against the Persian Empire in the form of the Ionian Revolt. So Cyrus may also have been hoping to appeal to that aspect of Milesian history. So that is Miletus. And in that light, the choice of a woman companion from Miletus, the younger one, according to Xenophon, makes a little more sense. If Cyrus is trying to maintain political support, he's going to choose deliberately, and he's going to choose someone who's going to be visible with him. And one of those people is apparently a woman from Miletus, which plays a large role in his professions of what he will and will not do for his friends in Asia Minor. So let's turn to the second city, Phocaea. And once again, the silting of the Hermus River here has diminished our modern ability to appreciate the strategic and geographical importance of Phocaea, which you can see out here on this peninsula. From Phocaea, you can control not only the Gulf of the Hermus, you have access up and down the coast here to the large islands of Lesbos and Chios. If it was not as prominent as Miletus was early on, Phocaea also has a reputation as a major colonizer and as a very prosperous city from early on. In the 540s, it resisted Persian conquest to the extent that the Phocaeans, according to Herodotus, actually sailed off, abandoning their city, although many came back to resettle the city afterward. And the evidence of Herodotus and of other sources, along with a series of coins starting in the 5th century from Phocaea, suggests that this city was an important Achaemenid base starting in the late 500s BC, understandably because of its strategic position. But just as Miletus played a central role in the Ionian Revolt, so too did Phocaea. The admiral of the allied Greeks in that revolt was in fact a Phocaean. And so Phocaea, just like Miletus, could stand as a symbol of Greek independence from Persian power, a fact that Cyrus must have known, and that might have helped his appeal to local Greek elites. Just as Miletus was a member of the empire, the Athenian Empire in the 5th century, so too was Phocaea, but our history here is much murkier. And I think the most we can say is by 412, it's gone over to the Spartans. And as John Hyland suggested, by around 406, it's back under Achaemenid control. 407 or 406, it's back under Achaemenid control or allied with Cyrus. And as late as the 390s, we have some suggestions it's still under Achaemenid control. So from our literary texts, we can get a set of ideas of why Phocaea might be important to Cyrus. And just as choosing a Milesian woman would indicate Cyrus' commitment to Miletus, choosing a Phocaean companion would indicate a connection with a city that was famous both as an Achaemenid base and as a site of resistance to imperial power. But there's one other thing about Phocaea that I want to focus on now, and that is about an hour east of the ancient site itself. This chart is from the 1890s, but it draws on surveys done in the 1830s. And you can see, if I highlight here, there's the site of the ancient city, which has been under excavation by Turkish archaeologists for several decades now. And even on this 1893 map, you can see here a ruin right there. And that is a unique monolithic tomb that has drawn much attention from scholars of Achaemenid archaeology in Western Anatolia. I was able to go back a bit into travelers' accounts and find what I think is the first drawing and description of this tomb by a French diplomat, Edouard Gauthier d'Arc, who traveled in the region about 1829 and describes and draws what he calls the Monument of the Jinn, the Monument des Génies. And Gauthier d'Arc was fascinated by this, and he may have been one of the first European travelers to see it because most travelers went by sea and not along the muddy and and difficult road going overland east out of Phocaea. So this may be the earliest modern drawing we have of this tomb. It was given the Greek name Pelakiti, the hewn out tomb, by local Greek speakers during the later 1800s. And the students of an evangelical school in the town of Phocaea actually published a brief article on it. You can see their sketch of this tomb here. Today we know it as Taş Kule, and you can see it as it's been restored by Turkish archaeologists with a fence around it to protect it, and a sort of archaeological park here at a very prominent location on the road east out of Phocaea. Now, what is the relevance of a rock-cut tomb for my discussion about the Palakae of Cyrus? There, by the way, is a view of the front. Well, as archaeologists have noted, this tomb is unique. It's not a Persian type of tomb. It's not an Anatolian type of tomb. It incorporates elements of both. And in particular, this door, false door arrangement has been compared with a relief depicting a sacrifice at a tomb door, which we know from the satrapal site of Daskaleon in the 5th century BC. The most detailed study of this tomb remains Nick Cahill's 1988 article on Taş Kule, and Cahill makes some points which are very, very relevant to our discussion here. First, he points out that if we look at the architecture of this tomb, the closest parallels in elements such as the moldings are to the tomb of Cyrus at Pasargadae, to the pyramid tomb, and to other tombs associated with the Achaemenid elites. But it's not an exact copy of any of those tombs. Nonetheless, the parallels are the closest with imperial monuments. As Cahill calls it, it's neither Iranian nor Anatolian. And he makes a fascinating argument that this type of tomb reflects the interests of a class of people who were either provincial Iranians or Persianized local elites. Today, we might put the word Persianized into scare quotations. And that it must have been constructed at a period when Phocaea was closely tied to the empire, and that local elites wanted to demonstrate those links through construction of such a monumental tomb. We can't get at the specifics, but what is fascinating is to see this major monument so close to the ancient site of Phocaea along the coast. So what do we do with this? How do we take this and relate it to concubines? And here I want to circle back to that name Milto, which you might have briefly noted when I talked about the ancient sources. What is in a name, Milto? According to Plutarch, Cyrus gave this name. Cyrus gave the name Aspasia to Milto, which was her original name, and we have to go to that romantic story of Aeolian to get a reason for that. At the bottom, our third quotation, Aeolian says her skin was tender, a complexion like roses. For this reason, the Phocaeans called her Milto while she was still a child. Now, the name Milto, you can in fact derive from the Greek word miltos, ruddle or vermilion. If you were interested in types of ruddle or vermilion, there are actually multiple different types, as archaeologists have discovered from surveys of ancient sites associated with miltos in the Aegean. This material was famous in Greek times as a material for protecting ship hulls, but also as a cosmetic and for other purposes. So I suppose it is possible that her name is derived from this, from an association with this mineral, which was in fact used for a cosmetic. There is another interesting explanation, though, which was suggested to me by my colleague Denise Dimitriou at UC San Diego, and that is that the term Milto as a name is a consonant alternation for Myrto, a name which is in fact common in ancient Greece and shows up as well in modern Greece, while the name Milto itself is a very rare or unique in terms of our ancient Greek sources. We have only one, this Milto, in the lexicon of Greek personal names. So it might be that this is just a throwaway for us. This is something that Aeolian has inserted into the story, and it's meaningless. But if we take a different perspective, which is an Achaemenid perspective, we might find another possibility. And this leads us back to, remember Alogune, the Babylonian, the concubine of Cyrus. And as I mentioned before, we can derive that name from an old Iranian name, meaning red or vermilion colored. And names that Greek authors render with this gune ending, according to Benveniste, are often, associated with names that have royal associations, Ferragune, Fratagune, Rodogune. So I think we might entertain the alternate possibility that if Alogune is a morpheme by morpheme translation of an old Iranian name, that Milto could possibly be a semantic loan. That is a Greek way of rendering a color name that appeared originally as a Persian name for this young woman. Perhaps a young woman who was of mixed Iranian and Greek ancestry, living in Phocaea, a town that had a strong imperial presence from the very beginning. This is speculative, but if we don't want to discard this name entirely, I think it is a fascinating possibility to consider. The fact that she is named as the daughter of Hermotimus is also interesting. We have a Hermotimus named as a servant of Xerxes by Herodotus. And if we look again at our lexicon of Greek personal names, of the 11 people we know named Hermotimus before 300, 6 of them are from Phocaea or nearby in Ionia. So if nothing else had survived about the Phocaeans' history, we might have her name. And this might in fact be an accurate rendering of this individual's real name. And that takes us to the almost to my penultimate slide, I think, is to ask about the part 2 of the name, Aspasia. Now, it occurred to me only in the course of revising this paper, a fact that, again, Dominique L'Enfant pointed out, that we don't have any ancient source that mentions Cyrus having a Persian wife. Now, it could just be that Xenophon did not mention it, but that seems less than likely, given that no other source mentions it. So this may reflect the actual fact that that Cyrus did not have an actual Persian wife. And if so, we're prompted to think again about Cyrus's naming of the Phocaean as Aspasia, especially in light of 2 passages from Plutarch's Pericles. According to Plutarch, Pericles allegedly split from his lawful Athenian wife to live openly with Aspasia of Miletus, a story that Cyrus likely would have been familiar with. And if he did not have a wife, the naming of his companion as Aspasia might be reflecting on this tradition about the famous Aspasia of Miletus. It's also interesting to notice that Plutarch mentions a tradition that Aspasia modeled herself on another famous Ionian woman, Thargelia, who allegedly got Greek cities to Medize, that is, to become sympathizers of the Persian Empire earlier on during the 5th century BC. So once again, while this is conjectural, while we might take Cyrus's naming either as an artifact of later fictional stories or just as personal whim, there may also be something here that reflects Cyrus's actual relationship with this woman. And then let's think about it from the Achaemenid court perspective. If Cyrus wasn't married, why was that? Why was he not married? And one possibility that we have to consider is that his father or his brother or someone or something else at court had prevented a marriage. And we have, in fact, several passages that suggest that in the time of Cyrus and his father and grandfather, that the royal marriage was made either by the king or by the parents together. You can see the examples here of Darius II and Artaxerxes II. In the absence of a Persian wife, Cyrus would have to turn elsewhere in order to show the kingly qualities. For example, as Madreiter and Schnegg point out, the king has to show his masculinity. He's the most masculine of all in the empire, and these 2 women would provide for Cyrus very visible evidence of that. They would also provide, in a practical sense, the potential for sons and successors. And you might say here, well, can a concubine's wife or the child of Autolycus become king? Cyrus' own family history, the fact that both of his parents shows that by his time, having a mother who was either of non-Persian parentage or of mixed parentage was not a bar to becoming king. And if you think about this from the perspective of local Persian elites in Anatolia, it might have been particularly attractive to imagine that Cyrus's children would be the descendants of people who had ties in Ionia itself and were tied to the local elites there rather than to the elites at the center of the empire. A couple of last points and then I'll wrap up. There we go. So let's take it all the way back to Xenophon's opening story, the story that we began with. One of the features of that account is that even though Xenophon does not name the two women, his account indicates that the two Polychi were both known and visible, both to Cyrus's Greeks and to Artaxerxes. The Greeks clearly had an idea of who the Phocian and the Milesian were. They could perhaps identify them on the battlefield. Xenophon already reports the tradition of the Phocian being wise and beautiful and wise. And some have suggested that Artaxerxes and his men actually knew what they were looking for when they got into camp. That is, they had a mission to seize the two women of Cyrus, suggesting, again, they were not mere pleasure objects. And Plutarch's story that Artaxerxes afterwards acquired Milto Aspasia and that she became a close companion of his also reminds us of the Neo-Assyrian court concubines, in which the companions of defeated kings might be acquired by the ruling king. So if we put that together with the other evidence about the political context of Miletus and Phocaea, we begin to see that these two women may have had a much more important function than merely being Cyrus's pleasure objects. Now, I've gone about 50 minutes, so I'm going to cut short, and I apologize once again for the hiccups in the slides. If I had to close this off, not with that slide, but with another slide which has disappeared, there. I think this is, I've hoped to have shown that although our evidence is very, very difficult to interpret, and that we have to deal with the challenges of the Greek narrative sources and ambiguities in every direction, as well as the kind of echo effect of going from Xenophon down to Plutarch, down to Aelian, that is a different reading that we might give of these two women. And if I have to encapsulate my entire hypothesis, I might end by saying this, that Polychi may equal politics and not just pleasure. So I think I will end there, and thank you for your attention. I look forward to any comments, suggestions, or thoughts you might have. So thank you very much.